what's it all about, this great bike race? What if there were annual bike races, the great bike race, we'll call it? The prize, the people's wealth dealt out according to how far you can get in a certain period of time. No obligation to participate, but if you don't, you might be unable to eat or have shelter for that year. Let's say that in your country, it's a free-for-all. Whatever bike you have, you can compete with. Got a 10-speed racing bike? Great. Got an old one with a bike chain that tends to fall off at high speeds? Yeah, fine. Got nothing? Okay, that's the brakes. And the media have a name for this. They call it democracy, because writers are allowed to compete with whatever they have without some nasty government restricting how they display their individuality, interfering with their freedom to express themselves in their bike tastes. Let's just suppose that in somewhere else, bikes are regulated for the race. They are supplied and repaired by the government. There is not that big of a difference between what the first and the last rider receives of the national wealth and those who aren't able to ride or cared for just because they're living beings. What is this government called? Why, tyranny, of course, because the owners of 10-speed racing bikes aren't allowed to use them in the race. And one last, let's suppose that in your country's race, the winner of the grand prize from the previous year has used his prize money to buy himself a motorized bike. It's a bike, he says, as he rides up to the starting line. Guess that's right, says the head judge, his drinking buddy. So, what are you going to do? Organize a strike? Slash some tires? Or perhaps it's time to question not just the rules made by the judges, nor even how the judges get elected or selected, but how the whole system of using a race to distribute wealth must be considered. Just perhaps.
Okay. The couple of people signed on after we did the introductions. Anthony, you want to introduce yourself?
Good morning, everybody. I am so sorry I missed Carolfrances' reflection. The last part of it sounded fascinating. I'm Quaker from Pasadena, co-founder of Making Housing and Community Happen, member of the board of ICUJP.
I have a someone named 476234. Could you introduce yourself? Hello?
Mike.
Muted.
Oh.
Ruby, you're on mute, Ruby.
Okay, is that you, Ruby?
Hey, I was just going, but I was on mute. Okay. I'm Carolfrances. That was a beautiful reflection. I'm a religious scientist. And hey, that thing about democracy, hey, we all can work on that and work with our children and our youth. Blessings. Oh, I'm with the Agape International Spiritual Center. I'm with the Ceasefire, and I'm on the board here at ICUJP.
Thank you. I see Grace has appeared. Would you introduce yourself?
Mike, Grace.
Grace, are you there? Disappeared. Anyway, okay, well, let's turn to affiliate reports.
Wait, Dick Bunce just appeared and
Dick
there's
Bunce.
Grace.
Oh, Dick, introduce yourself, please.
Hi, folks. Yeah, Dick Bunce, live and work in the Claremont, Pomona area, Claremont United Methodist Church, and Latina Roundtable, and a couple or three Institute for Ecological Civilization and Cobb Institute.
Thank you. I think we've got everybody except Grace.
Grace is here now.
Oh, there you are, Grace.
Hello,
Introduce-
everybody. Greetings from actually the south of France. I'm in the south of France right now. So I'm a few hours ahead of you. It's now about almost 5 o'clock our time. So I am with the Board of Housing Works Los Angeles and on other boards as well in the global setting. And a member of All Saints Church Pasadena and a longtime member of ICUJP.
All right. I think we've got everybody. Okay, do we have affiliate reports?
I've got an ICUJP report.
That's
It's a save the date, September 11, 2022, the 21st anniversary of 9/11 and the event that triggered the founding of ICUJP. In recent years, we have had the George Regas Courageous Peacemaker Awards presentation annually, and we will do that again this September 11. It's a Sunday. Plans are underway for a hybrid event, outdoors and live streamed. There's an organizing committee working on honorees, location, music, and all the other elements. I think it's shaping up as a powerful event. And so for now, just save because of using large screens and the sun going down outside. We anticipate the event will begin at about 6 or 6:30 in the evening on Sunday, September 11th. So just put that in your calendars for now, save that time period, and you'll be getting a lot more details and ways that you can participate, recognize peacemakers, and recognize ICUJP. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other affiliate reports? We have another person showed up, Clay. Would you introduce yourself? Hello? No, maybe out of earshot here. Okay, Steve, do you want to introduce our panel of speakers today?
I will.
What's that?
I will.
Who's I can't see.
Yo.
Carolfrances.
Okay.
Yeah. One of our people's not on, and I don't have his phone number, and I sent him an email, and maybe he'll come on, hopefully. If not, we'll have extra time and whatever. Anyway, thank you. Thank you all for showing up today for our discussion of alternatives to capitalism. There are all kinds of alternatives, and we're just going to be able to scratch the surface of possibilities today. Let me first introduce the panel and lay out what each will be covering. I, Carolfrances Likins, a retired teacher and member of UTLA, a writer and current ICUJP board member who has traveled to Cuba 9 times, will introduce some concepts and hopefully spark your minds. Then we'll hear from Bonnie Blustein, a member of the editorial collective Red Flag, Bandera Roja newspaper, the AFT 1521 Social Justice Committee, and a former ICUJP board member who will speak on why we should fight for communism and nothing less. Next, we'll hear from Michael Novick, retired teacher and UTLA member, chair of the local station board for KPFK, author of the book White Lies, White Power, editor of Turning the Tide, and a former ICUJP member, board member. And he will speak on why capitalism is inherently racist and imperialistic, and why socialism is the answer.
Carolfrances,
Yes.
I'm going to ask everyone who's not the actual speaker at the moment to go on mute. I noticed in a recording of these programs that if you are not on mute, the slightest sound directs the screen to your image and takes away from the speaker. So even though you're a panelist today, as several have just done, and I'm looking at the screen, except for Clay, he's connecting to audio, but now I hope everyone will be on mute during the program. Thanks. Sorry for the interruption, Carolfrances.
Okay, but thanks for that. We intend to close the panel presentation with the one panelist who's never been on ICUJP board, but who was a coordinator of the People's Summit for Democracy. Manolo de los Santos is a co-executive director of the People's Forum of New York, a researcher of Tricontinental Institute for the Social Research, and a co-editor of the books Viviremos, Venezuela versus the Hybrid War, and Comrade of the Revolution, selected speeches of Fidel Castro. Manolo, if he shows up, will speak on Cuba, a living example of socialism. Now, if he doesn't show up, I don't know what happened, but maybe some of us who have been to Cuba can talk briefly about Cuba as a living example of socialism. What we'll not be spending a whole lot of time on doing today is dealing with the cruelties that the US is guilty of inflicting on people in the environment. For we believe that most, if not all of you, already know these things. What we will be doing is looking at the ways that these horrors are rooted in capitalism and what a few alternative systems might offer. This is not to say that we should cease our work for changes in laws and changes in this or that thing, but that we should also work for the goal of beyond that, namely system change. As an alternative to society's teaching their children, you can do great things and get ahead of others. Are there systems that teach instead, it feels wonderful to contribute to society and pull others up with you as you rise? Capitalism raised us on many misunderstandings, especially my generation, which, shaped by McCarthyism, learned to hide under desks in case those big, bad, scary Russians dropped a bomb on our school. And when I was growing up, I never once heard the word socialist, capitalist, or even working class. We were taught it was all about democracy versus capitalism. Let's make it clear, capitalism, socialism, and communism are economic systems. Democracy and dictatorships are political systems. There is no reason that democratic politics cannot go hand in hand with socialist economics. And so to ask, is somebody not muted?
Irena came on with an iPhone as well as her computer, and it created feedback. I just muted it.
Okay. Okay, and so to ask, is democracy preferable to communism? Is like asking, do you prefer long fruits or yellow ones? I don't think that that most of us working class people of my generation or any others ever hated communism. What we learned to hate and fear was the word communism. The economic system denoted by the word was never presented to most of us. We were never asked, for instance, to choose between, on one hand, to each according to strength, from each according to vulnerability, as opposed to, on the other hand, to each according to need, from each according to ability. In fact, the closest I came growing up to understanding was when my older brother one day teased me by telling me that the nuns that I loved were communists because they lived together in a convent and shared everything. By the way, countries that are called communist aren't. Years ago, Angela Davis told a group of us that no nation has yet built a communist economy. I was at first shocked, but then I got it. So what is the problem with capitalism? I want us to consider 3 possible characteristics of an economic system and imagine what it would be like if all 3 were in one. One characteristic is that it divides people into groups with opposing interests, pitting them against each other. The second is that it makes people in the smaller group powerful and the masses vulnerable. The third is that it alienates the powerful from the vulnerable. If you and I have opposing interests, but I have no power to take what I want from you, then it wouldn't matter that much. And if I did have more power than you, but I knew you and I cared about you as a friend, then I would not use my power to hurt you. If we had conflicting interests, we'd just likely negotiate it out. But what if all 3 of these things were characteristic of one system? What if an economic system were to divide people into groups with opposing interests, let's say around raising of wages or the funding of worker safety, inherently pitting worker against boss? What if this system also makes the people in one group more powerful than the other? This boss versus worker. And what if the workers in the sweatshop remain to the boss in this luxurious corporate office, nothing more than figures on a spreadsheet? Then you have capitalism. We're told that the boss has to make ever rising profits or he'll go out of business. So we're asked if we can really fault him for choosing his own survival over the health, safety, and livelihood of the workers and their communities and the environment. I would say, yes, we do fault him, but I'd go on to say that's ultimately the wrong question. What we should be asking is whether an economic system that empowers the boss to make these decisions is an evil system. Under capitalism, in other words, the boss, the bourgeoisie, gets to ask and answer the question, Are the benefits to us worth the price that they have to pay? So consider as an alternative, what if there were no non-working bosses? What if the land and the means of production were owned by, let's say, a democratically elected government or by worker cooperatives? Or what if, as among the first people who lived here, the land were considered to be owned by the Great Spirit? And what we've learned from childhood to find, what if we had learned from childhood to find joy in contributing whenever possible and expect to receive whenever we were in need? That's what we're here today to think about. These are revolutionary thoughts. Now, let's be clear, this doesn't necessarily mean violence. Nonviolent revolution is not a contradiction of terms. By revolution, we mean the total turning over of a system, the burying of it, and the building of something new. So I want to close with this. From where so many beautiful peoples are apartheided away from each other in the shadow of towering palaces, from where the owners of the nation taking the funds from the poor schools of their own land to fund the military of the owners of another is called democracy. From where the people are narcoticized into submission by the media hype of machine-made pleasure. From where people exercise the right to grumble to each other while boasting of their cherished apoliticality, only to revel in glory at the waving of the national emblem. From where the military has to ask to receive, but schools are ordered to do more with less. From there, he journeys to the land recognized to be the jewel of public education by all but his own nation and its global subjects, to where the barracks, even the barracks of the past, have been converted into schools, to where miracles are found, to where miracles take the form of pesos found in a battered economy when educational needs arise, to where teachers take off as volunteers in some war-ravaged nation that shares their belief that the best defense from all enemies is an educated population. From there to here, he comes and he asks her, and what about the education's role in eradicating racism? Without a pause for thought, she answers, the first thing you have to do is have a revolution. So, Bonnie, you are going to tell us why we should fight for communism now.
Okay, thank you, Carolfrances. I'm not a poet. I put in the chat a link to Red Flag for people who want to read about actual garment workers in El Salvador, maquilas, who are organizing for communism, young people in the streets in India who are organizing for communism, and much more. I'm going to pull this up on my screen and read it. Okay, so many people around the world know that capitalism is not working for them. Okay, from Ecuador to Sri Lanka and beyond, people simply cannot live in the old way. And mass protests are making it harder for elites to rule in the old way. Even in the United States, some 40% of poll respondents and a majority of young adults have a negative view of capitalism. Capitalism not only doesn't, it can't work for most people. That's actually a different argument than the one I'm going to address today. I think the harder question is what a post-capitalist society should be. What is it that people will want to fight for? If they don't have a good answer, anti-capitalist folks will be more likely to fall prey to the fascists who try to divert their anti-capitalist anger against the other via racism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, nationalism, and all the rest. So there are two separate but intertwined parts to the question of what to struggle for. First, the values and principles our post-capitalist society should embody, and second, how that can work. As people of faith, the values part should come first, and I don't think it's that hard. I've never met anyone whose vision of heaven includes cash registers or credit cards. I'll suggest today why I think the world we need is a communist world without borders or nations, a world in which wage labor, money, and markets have been replaced by a social organization based on the principle from each according to ability and commitment to each according to need. Now, some argue that the concepts of Eden or the equivalent in other religions reflect longings for earlier ways of life before the rise of exploitation and class society. For most of human prehistory, our ancestors mainly lived in relatively free, equal, and cooperative ways. Many indigenous people on all continents did so well into historic times, some into the late 20th century, before imperialism destroyed their ability to do so. I'll post in the chat in a few minutes the title of a recent book called The Dawn of Everything, which is not perfect, it has a lot of shortcomings, but it does offer many reasons for hope. Hope that we too, like people in the ancient past, can consciously remake our social world to serve human needs as we understand them instead of profits. Now, Marx described what he called a higher phase of communist society in which, it's a quote, after the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and therewith also the antithesis between mental and physical labor has vanished, after labor has become not only a means of life, but life's prime want, after the productive forces have also increased with the all-around development of the individual and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, when the narrow horizon of bourgeois right can be crossed in its entirety and society inscribed on its banners, from each according to ability to each according to needs. That was 1875. That same slogan had been used by other socialists and anarchists like August Becker in 1844, Louis Blanc in 1851. But other socialists advocated from each according to ability to each according to work. A very different principle indeed. In fact, that's one of the main differences between communism and socialism. As Alexandra Kollontai dramatized in her 1920s fiction, Love of Worker Bees, the socialist principle leaves some, often women, worse off than others. Long before that, French utopian Etienne Gabriel Morelli proposed sacred and fundamental laws that would tear out the roots of vice and of all the evils of a society. And he included, I'm not updating the gendered language, one, he said, nothing in society will belong to anyone, either as a personal possession or as capital goods, except the things for which the person has immediate use, for either his needs, his pleasures, or his daily work. 2, every citizen will be a public man, sustained by, supported by, and occupied at the public expense. 3, every citizen will make his particular contribution to the activities of the community according to his capacity, his talent, and his age. If you go back even further, Christian communities from the 17th century and earlier had similar principles. The 1639 Guilford Covenant, which was a group that was helping themselves to indigenous land in what they called New England, promised, quote, ourselves and our families and those who belong to us, go figure, should be helpful to each other in any common work, according to every man's ability and his need shall require. Now, their roots were in the Acts of the Apostles, okay, in which we find that the community of believers was of one heart and mind, and no one claimed that any of his possessions was his own, but they had everything in common. There was no needy person among them, for those who owned property or houses would sell them, bring the proceeds of the sale, and put them at the feet of the apostles, and they were distributed to each according to need. Implied here, I think, is that all contributed according to their ability and according to their commitment to the community. And the Reverend Bert Newton pointed out to me that according to need is actually suggested in Exodus, when Moses tells his patriarchally organized people about manna. He said, gather of it every man according to his eating, and omer for every man according to the number of your persons. Take ye every man for them which are in his tents. And if the children of Israel did so and gathered some more, some less, and when they did mete it out with an omer, he that gathered much had nothing over, and he that gathered little had no lack. They gathered every man according to his eating. So how could a communist society work today? In Exodus, a divine hand guaranteed that everyone had the food they needed, no more, no less. But if we are to envision a community of believers with communism itself as the guiding principle, and I would say a global community, we, like the apostles and later communities inspired them, will ourselves have to decide what is needed. It also seems unrealistic to think that the global system of production would or should revert to one with no division of labor at all, in which every household produces everything it needs to flourish, if such a system ever really existed, and it probably didn't. So production needs to be organized as well as distribution. If not by capitalists seeking but to maximize profits at the expense of the environment, as well as human lives dictated by markets, then how and by whom? Now, Marx was not ready to tackle questions like those. He implied that the answer could only come when the productive forces have also increased and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly. But the Communist Manifesto had earlier declared that modern capitalist society, quote, is like the sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld whom he has called up by his spells, referencing Goethe's poem. By 1940, in the film Fantasia, the forces of production depicted in The Sorcerer's Apprentice scene clearly did not need to increase, but to be brought under control, so the wealth produced by workers' labor can flow more abundantly toward meeting the needs of the producers. The problem isn't lack of abundance. The problem is that capitalism's inner drive to maximize profits leads to rising inequality, prices of overproduction, environmental destruction, and more. Furthermore, we have a great deal of collective experience that the masses are, if anything, more eager to share when there is hardship rather than abundance. In crises, for example, often the poorest in material goods are the richest in the spirit of generosity. So why did Marx believe that a higher phase of communist society had to wait? Why did the Bolsheviks end their emergency war communism once production was restored to a more secure footing? Why did Mao's Communist Party of China put the brakes on Red Army veterans who returned to their villages wanting to implement something like the communist supply system they had experienced as soldiers? Why, in short, was the 20th century communist movement committed to a stages theory in which socialism, to each according to work, was seen as a necessary precondition for eventual communism? Why do so many today remain committed to this, even though no 20th century socialist society evolved into communism, and so many are now fully capitalist and even imperialist? The masses aren't ready for communism, some say, but that's a circular argument. When communists propagandize and organize for reforms or for national liberation or for socialism or for anything else but communism, how would they then find the masses ready for communism? This may not be the time or place for this much larger discussion, but I do want to recommend again The Dawn of History. One of its main accomplishments is to demolish Morgan's 19th century framing of history as passing invariably in stages from what he called savagery to barbarism to civilization. Engels and subsequent Marxists built on Morgan's work, which was the best anthropology of its time. But Dawn uses the last half century of much better anthropology and archaeology to refute this, although they miss a lot of really good feminist stuff. And in so doing, they indirectly question the stages theory of post-capitalist society. It's really worth a read. If anyone wants to discuss it, we could organize another book group. Okay. Okay, finally, I suggested earlier that values and organization are distinct but not separate questions. To create a communist society demands revolutionary organization as well as education and agitation now around the principles and values of that society we want to build in the future. It means involving the broadest possible masses in the fullest possible discussions of all decisions and helping carry them out and evaluate them. That's how communism could work in the future. That is why Red Flag Bandera Roja represents one international mass party, not a coalition of national parties or a party with internal borders like national sections, a party that doesn't place barriers in the way of youth and workers who want to join, that welcomes everyone who shares the dream of a world where we can fulfill life's prime want of unalienated labor as we are willing and able, secure that we will be taken care of as we take care of others. As the narrator of William Morris's 1890 communist utopian novel, News from Nowhere, says at the end of his adventure, if others can see it as I have seen it, then it may be called a vision rather than a dream.
Thank you, Bonnie. So, Michael, you're going to tell us, is capitalism inherently racist and imperialistic? And what is the socialist alternative?
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, for some reason I'm not showing up on the speaker at the screen. I'm not sure why that is, because I have it on speaker view and I'm still in just a small box. But I'll go ahead, and maybe other people are seeing me that way. If other people could mute, I think that would be helpful.
We can hear you fine.
Okay, thank you. I want to take a step back in a sense. I don't disagree with what Bonnie said about the need for communism. But I think if we want to understand how to abolish, uproot, and supersede capitalism, we need to understand what capitalism is and how it developed in the world and created the world that we live in today. And I think it's fundamental to that to understand that although there were systems of class society prior to capitalism, there were forms of oppression prior to capitalism, and forms of oppression and exploitation prior to capitalism. Capitalism is unique in being a global system that has incorporated all the masses of humanity into a single economic system and superseded and incorporated all the previous forms of oppression and exploitation, patriarchy. And I think it's fundamentally based, as I say, on racism and imperialism. There were empires prior to capitalism, but they were different in nature. They were based on tribute. They did shape some of the societies that they encountered. There was, the Greeks Hellenized some of the societies that they conquered. The Romans certainly Romanized them. But they were still based essentially on tribute. They were based on fairly clear process of theft and not on total transformation of the economic life of people and the political, social, and cultural, spiritual lives of the people who were conquered. And capitalism, however, did do all of that. And the reason it did it in some ways was unconscious, but capitalism is based on a new kind of division in the world. And although there were prior systems of production that people were engaged in, the nature of people's relationship to each other and to the land is fundamentally different than the capitalism. And it's based on several factors that were unique to capitalism as it developed, which were to say land theft, genocide, racial enslavement, chattel slavery. And those features are essential to the nature of what capitalism is and how it spread and developed. So, there were forms of private property. They were mostly personal. There were forms of land ownership and land tenure prior to capitalism. But capitalism invented some of the following things. The concept of really, I want to take issue with one thing I think that people sometimes talk about, because we often talk about the nation state. And, Stalin came up with these principles of what forms a nation and how they can form a state. And I think that those were wrong-headed. If you look at the development of states in Europe in particular, and I think capitalism is a phenomenon basically of European colonialism. There were seeds of capitalism in Timbuktu and in China, India, other places, but they never developed in the same way as they did based on the fact of European conquest and enslavement of other peoples. And the European states that developed were not nation states, they were empire states. If you look at Spain in 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella consolidated a state in that territory that incorporated people who spoke many different languages and was based on expulsion of Moors and Muslims and Jews. If you look at France, France also was incorporated around people who spoke different languages. The so-called United Kingdom that we know today, Welsh is not English. Gaelic is not English. There are different languages. There were people who absorbed into empires, little mini empires. And the basis of that, in the form of capitalism, developed on that basis of empire and of claiming territory and conquering people. I think the David Graeber stuff that Bonnie referred to is very, very important for understanding that it's not about stages, but I think it is important to understand that capitalism is fundamentally distinct from other forms of oppression and exploitation. Debt existed before capitalism, but not in the form of capitalist debt, which is different. Land tenure existed before capitalism, but not in the kind of privatization of land that is embodied in the imperial conquests of the Americas that laid the basis. And so if you look at, for example, the dispossession of the enclosures that took place in Europe and the dispossession of the peasants from the land that turned them into proletarians, that's all based on the prior land theft and genocide that took place in the Americas and the prior enslavement of African people. And that laid the basis for a bourgeoisie. If you look at the development of some of the things we think about as central to capitalism, for example, the system of corporations and of double entry bookkeeping and of stock exchanges, all of that was rooted in the imperial project of a few European countries that created those systems in order to carry out the conquest of the Americas and the enslavement of African people. And so the first corporations in the world are the corporations created for that project. The Africa Company and the Royal Africa Company were joint stock operations. Such a thing had never existed before. The Hudson's Bay Corporation, the British East India Corporation, all were created as economic forms based on the fact that the costs and the risks of imperial conquest and colonization, particularly of settler colonialism, cannot be borne except by creating out of the blue a franchise for limited liability and joint stock ownership, beyond the capacity even of the rulers themselves to generate the wealth necessary to carry out those enterprises. And so the nature of debt under capitalism as well is predicated not just on borrowing and repayment for a season or to generate crops and then create enough wealth to pay back off the debt and have some surplus left. It's not based on the relationship of bonded enslavement where people were captured and put to work. It's based on a system that believes that it's possible to create and generate wealth far beyond the capacity of the generator to apply it. And so that's the nature of the privatization. If you look at how the African slaves were treated, it's unique in world history. They were simultaneously capital. They were a means of production. They were simultaneously commodities. They were bought and sold and traded. And the development of bookkeeping primarily was based on the record keeping of how many slaves were being bought and sold and what their value was. And they were labor, and they were exploited labor. And that's distinct in the world, and capitalism is still marked by that transformation of human relations and transformation of relations to the land. Again, the enslavement of Africans was predicated on, first, the conquest of the lands of the indigenous people of the Americas, and both are based on dehumanization. If you look at some of the theories of democracy in John Locke, they're predicating the idea that essentially the indigenous people of the Americas lived in a state of nature. They were not humans. They were not people engaged in the development and relationship to the land that Europeans were. And therefore they were wild and savage, as that dichotomy that Bonnie referred to earlier of savagery and so on. That's not the case. That was a falsehood, but a falsehood is predicated on that idea that Europeans alone were capable of increasing the value of the land they worked. And so even the concept of democracy that we have is fundamentally flawed because it's based on that racial hierarchy and that land theft and the justification of the land theft.
Oh,
I'm sorry. Richard, can you mute, please?
sorry.
Richard.
I'm
Thank you.
sorry.
It's okay. And I think it's important to understand this. I think it's important to understand this because we can't overturn it and overcome it without understanding its roots and its nature. And I think, therefore, it's important to understand that the process of ending capitalism has to begin with the process of decolonization and of rehumanization of both, which means, as Bonnie talked about, that there's a single human race on all the planet. And that the concept of racism and racial superiority, racial inferiority, racial division is something that arose out of capitalism and out of the conquest of indigenous people in the Americas, the denial of their humanity, the denial of their capacity to interact with nature in a different way, the imposition of private property and land at the point of a sword and a gun, and then the dehumanization of Africans as instead of humans co-equal with all other humans, Africans were reduced to chattel slavery as they were considered property. They were considered and treated, as I said, as capital, as labor, and as commodities. And unless we understand that that has to be uprooted completely, and that the process of decolonization is essential to liberation, we're not going to get anywhere. We've seen, as Bonnie talked about, many efforts to create socialism. If you predicate socialism as Marx, in a certain sense, did on this idea of stages and this idea of the forces of production and the capacity, then you believe that somehow socialism is predicated on the most advanced industrial societies, creating a proletariat that then takes over. And the kernel of truth in that is that what Marx said is that capitalism creates a form of class society in which there's a class of people with an interest in overturning all of class society. But that can only be done if we understand that the classes that were created in Europe were based on this pre-existing dehumanization of peoples and incorporation of peoples in the entire globe. Capitalism as it exists today did not develop independently in Africa and independently in Asia and independently in Oceania. Capitalism was imposed in a system of empire, capitalist imperialistic empires that created a single economic system. I want to give one story, and I'll probably try to wrap up so we can have some discussion, or if our fourth speaker comes on. But a couple of years ago, I went to visit my granddaughter in Sweden. And I'm happy to say that she is a Swede now. She was born here, but she went back to Europe and, has a life and a family there and is raising children there as Swedes. On the way, I was reading a book called The Trade. And it was a book written by a man who was the descendant of slave owners here in the United States. And he and his family, he actually had the same exact name as the founder of the slave owning family, although he was fairly disconnected from it because he lived in California. Most of them lived in Rhode Island, where that slave owner and his family had been created. And the family got together to discuss the whole question of reparations and what is the wealth that they have fallen heir to based on, and how can they make amends for that. And they had discussions. They went to Africa. They went to the places where the slaves were stolen from. They went to, I believe, Cuba and somewhere else, because when slavery was abolished in the United States, capitalistic slavery, capitalism was not abolished and slavery was not abolished. And so the person involved in the slave trade in Rhode Island actually migrated to Cuba, where slavery still existed under the Spanish Empire, to persist and persevere in enslaving people and gaining their wealth. And so it was a fascinating sort of collective biography of this family and how they developed and where their wealth came from. And in the nature of it, the family that started it were not slave owners. They were people involved in the slave trade, quote unquote, the so-called triangular trade. There were people involved in shipbuilding and people involved in banking. And all the wealth of shipbuilding and all the wealth of banking in the United States was based on enslavement of African people and their use on land stolen from indigenous people and expropriated. And I think one of the fundamentals that's important to understand about capitalism is it continues to be based on expropriation, not just on exploitation, not just on exploiting the labor of individual people and taking the surplus value created, but on theft, on direct theft, and it continues to do it. And Bonnie knows probably about some of the land grabs still going on by academic institutions in the United States. Brown University and Harvard, which are lamenting their role in the slave trade, are right now stealing land in Africa and stealing land in Asia for capitalistic enterprise. So I was reading this book on my travels as I went. It was a very, very long trip from California to Sweden. I got to Sweden and, we had a very nice visit. And my granddaughter said, "Oh, why don't you go to the Maritime Museum? It's really interesting." She lives in Gothenburg, which is on the sort of North Sea side of Sweden. And so I went to the Maritime Museum and I'm going around looking at the various exhibits. And it turns out the Maritime Museum is inside a building known as the Swedish East India Company headquarters. And the Swedish East India Company headquarters was set up because Europeans were addicted to sugar. And the Swedes got a taste for sugar and wanted more sugar. And they traded land in Sweden for a depot for the French in return for one of the French sugar colonies in the Caribbean, so that they could manufacture sugar themselves through enslaved African people in the Caribbean. Not only that, but in the museum, they describe the maritime industry and the other industries of Sweden. And they say the basic development of Swedish capitalism and enterprise was based on selling Swedish timber and Swedish iron to British slave owners for the construction of slave vessels and for the making of the shackles in which African people were enslaved. And so this is the global economy of capitalism. And then later, I went to a second museum and they talk about the depopulation and repopulation of Sweden. And Sweden is now a multiracial country. They have absorbed people from all around the world, as many other societies have. But Sweden itself was depopulated under capitalism and imperialism because people in the tens of thousands were attracted to the Americas, where there was land stolen. And the same thing happened in Ireland. My father came to the United States from Poland. The same thing happened in multiple European societies because of the land theft and genocide and class stratification and racial stratification of the United States. Europeans were imported to the Americas from many, many societies, defusing the class contradictions in those societies by implanting people in the Americas. So there's a famous book called How the Irish Became White by Noel Ignatieff, and he ignores a fundamental aspect. He talks about the conflict between Irish labor and enslaved African labor, but he ignores the fact that when the Irish came to the Americas, they came for land, and they came for native land. If you look at Bacon's rebellion, sometimes shown as a model of interracial solidarity and class struggle, but actually they were all fighting over access to more native land. The Irish who first came to America overturned the agreement in Pennsylvania between the Quakers and the indigenous people to recognize native sovereignty of most of the land in Pennsylvania. And they said, no, this prevents us from getting land. We want land. And they overthrew basically the government of Pennsylvania and Benjamin Franklin and some of those people and said, no, we are settlers. We want to colonize this land and take it and use it. So that's the fundamental system that we're dealing with. And it brands itself all across the world and incorporates all the pre-existing forms of oppression, of patriarchy, of class stratification. It incorporates Aryan mythology of the Indians, the conquest that took place there of one group against others. And it incorporates all of that into a system that drives itself into the brains, the psyches, the everyday life of every person on this planet in that form of racial and social stratification, economic exploitation and expropriation. And until we can grapple with that, and until we can begin to engage with the struggles for decolonization and resistance that have persevered through all those 500 some odd years, and the people who are still here struggling, the indigenous people of the Americas, the indigenous people of Africa, Asia, Oceania, we will not be able to overturn this system and replace it with something else. And, I personally, I'm an anarcho-communist. I agree. I think that the whole idea of, stages is not the appropriate one. I think that if we can begin this process of decolonization, of self-determination, of rehumanization, and discarding these racial categories. And so if you look at Turning the Tide, we changed the name. I mean, the group is still called Anti-Racist Action, but the subtitle of the magazine is now the Journal of Intercommunal Solidarity, on the idea that it's not based on nation states, and it's not based on, that form of socialist state power. It's based on intercommunalism and on a revolutionary form of solidarity and unity. And I think that's critical because we will not be able to, many of us are opposed to racism, we're opposed to militarism, we're opposed, we want peace and justice. But unless we see that those things are inextricable in capitalism, we're not going to be able to resolve them or solve them or overturn that and replace it with something better. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, our fourth speaker has not shown up. So I am just going to say something about Cuba and socialism. The last caravan reported that they didn't see any homelessness, nobody sleeping on the benches or whatever. That's always been the case. I remember walking through a park with Paula once in Havana, and after we left, she laughed and said, you know, I just instinctively looked around for the homeless and they weren't there. So we know that. I mean, that's pretty well known, but what's not known is the reason they're able to do that, even during the pandemic, which hit them as hard as anyone, is that they're socialists. And it says in the Constitution, I do not remember the exact percentage, but it says in the Constitution, nobody can be charged rent for more than a certain very small percent of their income. And the majority of people in Cuba own their own homes, small that they may be. But the fact that it says in the Constitution that you can't be charged rent higher than a certain percent of your income, if people lose their income with the pandemic, then they can't be charged rent. And we don't have to have the landowners, the building owners, the corporate, whatever of them arguing, no, we need our rents, because there aren't any. It's owned by the government. And another thing that I remember reading in a book called Ernesto Che Guevara in Economics. I don't remember the name, but it was by Dr. Carlos, just blanked on his name, Tablada. He's a Cuban economist. And he said that Che worked it out that everybody would have, they worked out how you advance through the whatever work sector that you have, according to your abilities and your willingness to work hard. But it was all worked out in the, ahead of time through the socialist economics. And another thing is they are more likely to change with new pressures. The fall of the Soviet Union, the increase of US sanctions under Trump, which Biden, by the way, has refused to roll back. All those changes, they're able to adapt to. And now, according to I'm sorry, this was not prepared because somebody else was going to be speaking on this. They're going to worker cooperatives. And, instead of state-owned land. Oh, Manolo, you're in. Manolo?
Steve said he appeared on screen about a half hour ago and then disappeared.
Oh, really?
Let me
Well,
switch
that's
the
weird.
view.
Okay, so I will finish. So you have a system where the price of bread is can be lower than the cost of making it. And they up the cost of non-essentials so that nobody has to go without the essentials because it costs more to make that. It's all regulated so that people will all be able to get what they need. I mean, it's really an incredible system. And anyway, I'm going to leave it open unless Michael, you want, or anybody else who's been to Cuba wants to say something on that.
Yeah, I want to say a couple of words more. I think that, in my visit to Cuba, they talked very frankly about the question of racism and racial oppression in Cuba, and the fact that they were consciously seeking to overcome it, and by creating a sense that Cuba's identity was based on, in part, the African identity and the African aspect of the Cuban people and personality, and uplifting that. And just you have the People Summit. One of the factors of the People Summit was a visit by three Venezuelan feminists who spoke there. And then the next day we had a session with them with DSALA. And they talked very similarly about the fact that in Venezuela, the struggle for 21st century socialism has to do with reintegrating the indigenous and African people and uplifting their aspects of Venezuelan society and culture. And I think that, again, it speaks to the thing I've been trying to talk about. I think that the process of decolonization, of rehumanization, of overcoming racial division is central to overcoming capitalism and seeing that those are creations of capitalism. I see hands are coming up, so maybe we should just switch to conversation. The other thing I want to say in relation to struggles here, because a lot of us have struggled around the issue of homelessness, and I think that that's fundamentally based on that land theft. And if we've had native speakers, I think, talking about the whole question of title and land tenure, and land title and land tenure in the United States are based on land theft, based on terra nullius and the Europeans imposing this idea that the land was here to be claimed and privatized by the empires and parceled out to the settlers. And that's the basis of rent and the basis of privatization, the basis of capitalizing land as a factor of production and trying to create wealth out of speculation in housing as a commodity. So anyway, Carolfrances, you want to start calling on people? Or?
I think we need to move into Q&A.
Yeah.
Great.
I've got 3 hands up already. That be acceptable to our panel to start that?
Yes.
Okay. And the first hand that went up was Fernando. Can we hear you out here?
Yeah, clearly, communism is a lot superior than imperialism, And as I wondered here in the U.S., why is it really unpopular? Central America and other nations is really going toward liberation and so forth. And it's sad because when you look at the condition of the United States, a lot of homelessness, a lot of joblessness, and so forth. And it seems the communism doesn't have no effect. And so maybe the panelists can answer some of them, in terms of the condition here in the United States. Thank you.
Who wants to take that one?
People are familiar. Bonnie, go ahead. Why don't you speak first?
Well, people of my generation got a very, very heavy dose of anti-communism all the time we were growing up. I remember a liberal youth group, somebody coming to speak and talking about how there really wasn't a spectrum from left to right. Actually, it was a circle, and the left and the right met, and the opposite of totalitarianism was democracy, and so we got a very heavy dose of that. Now, I think a section of the US ruling class believed its own propaganda about the end of history after the fall of the Soviet Union. And they eased up on this anti-communism because their argument was it was no longer relevant. And so what I find when I go to rallies, whether it's about Dobbs or whether it's about Black Lives Matter or immigrant rights in the United States, what I'm finding in Los Angeles is that young adults are overwhelmingly open to the idea of communism. They'll say things like, oh, a communist paper, cool. You know, and so I think that what's mainly required is people who believe in, people having relationships with a lot more people in which they can struggle with them about why they have knee-jerk reactions against communism if they do, and also that the key front for organizing in the United States is, you know, among people my niece's age and not among my age. The other thing I would say is that I think people in the United States are going to be profoundly affected when people in other parts of the world start embracing communism and fighting for it. And we're seeing that already somewhat, you know, with comrades in South Africa and India are writing about it, and everyone who hears about it knows that it's like, wow, this is cool. So I think that the West is not in fact leading around this. I think it is people from other parts of the world who are leading. But I think in the United States, you know, we are fighting the propaganda arm of the ruling class, namely the mass media, the schooling system. I won't call it an education system. And all the rest of it, but the propaganda contradicts people's own lived experience, and so that's what we have to grab a hold of.
I'll just chime in for a minute. I think that historically in the United States, anti-communism has been wrapped up with white supremacy. If you look at the history of Christian nationalism and the Christian schools that were created, it was specifically about, you know, the opposition to desegregation. And you look today at the most reactionary forces in the U.S. society are clearly the ones advocating white supremacy and exterminationism. I'll leave it at that. You know, I think that there is people have been, well, I'll say this, you know, Marx talked about capitalism is based on competition among the workers. And that competition is primarily organized on racial and national bases and creating hierarchies and privileges and trying to get people to buy into capitalism based on those things.
Michael, if I can just build on that a second, it's not just the propaganda, it's also the fact that it's rooted in the wage system. It's rooted in the fact that people are individually responsible for their own household survival. And so the workers are, society is structured to force workers to compete with each other. And that's fertile ground in which the Christian nationalism and the racism and all the rest of it have to work.
I think Steve's hand was up next.
Thank you. I really found this fascinating. I learned a lot. I took a lot of notes. I was scribbling, which is why I'm going to ask some questions. I do want to say, Dawn of Everything, I've read about half of it. I encourage people to read it. On my table right now is the book-length volume of the 1619 Project, which I also encourage people to add to their reading list, that digs deep into the nature of slavery and exploitation in the United States. I'm not clear on how each of the speakers is distinguishing socialism from communism. And I'd like if each of you would dig deep into that. And beginning with Bonnie, and I was scribbling notes, but I heard you say in some form or in some setting that under socialism, women are worse off. So beginning with that clarification, and then that fundamental question, if you see socialism and communism differently. I hear a critique of the stages of economic revolution, whether socialism is a step toward communism or is a different economic system. So I'd be grateful for your thoughts on that, beginning with Bonnie.
Okay, so I think if you want to reduce it to slogans, right? Communism is to each according to need, and socialism is to each according to work. Now, capitalism is basically each according to how much their ancestors were able to steal. But that's a separate question. So one problem with, as an economic system, to each according to work, is that some people, that first of all, it assumes that people are still working for wages. And even if wages are more or less unequal, people still have different capacities to do work. And people have different needs. And so what Kollontai was writing about in the 1920s is not the question of whether women were better off in 1920s Soviet Union than they had been before the revolution. That was a given. They were much better off in a whole lot of ways than they had been before. But she was describing, and she worked in real life on the woman question a lot too. So this was based on experiences, is that women who had children to care for, even with publicly available childcare, were still stretched much thinner and either remaining in dependence on a man or struggling to support their own children themselves on what they were able to earn, which was not necessarily enough, right? So even if you and I get the same wages, if you have 3 children and a grandmother to support, and I'm just taking care of myself, we're going to have different standards of living. And then if you throw in valuation, different value placed on different work, that is not every, in some socialist systems, people are paid according to hours worked, in others, but in most of them, work points, if not wages, or have been assigned based on the kind of work done or the quality of work done. And so some people are clearly not as able as others. There's a great story about that. Here's another one, from Eighth Heaven to Eighth Hell, which was a biography of a leader in Maoist China who was a veteran who came back to his small town, and people were forming work teams. Each work team was going to be self-sufficient. And in his village, the able-bodied men had already collaborated and formed a work team where they were kind of like the strong ones, and they were going to do really well. And this Red Army veteran, who was perfectly able-bodied, and they wanted him to join that group, he said no, he was going to join a group of people who were less able for various reasons. And he was able, and they were able to succeed phenomenally because he was able to organize them on the basis of basically communist principles. And he became very, very famous for that all over China. So that was the Eighth Heaven. He was like a labor hero. But then that contradicted the socialists, to each according to work. And so then with the change of, I guess, the reversal of socialism in China, he was then cast as a demon. The idea is that I'm trying to get across is that since everybody can't work equally and everyone's needs are not equal, from each according to ability to each according to work leaves people unequal in a way that the communist principle to each according to need would not. I think there's other differences, but I think that's, I think there's a lot of other questions, but that's one.
Would Michael and Carolfrances want to comment on that?
Well, briefly, I think that the history of socialism as a movement is wrapped up with some of the things I talked about. A lot of the early socialists were essentially thought that socialism was a better way to run imperial societies, and I think there's also a factor in which, particularly in the Soviet socialism, was predicated on the idea that under state socialist control, the Communist Party had to complete the agricultural revolution that the Russian bourgeoisie wasn't able to do. And so I think that the history of socialism, as we know it in the world, is wrapped up in an inadequate critique of capitalism and of imperialism. I do think what I said earlier, I don't believe exactly in stages, but I do think that it's going to be a long process to overturn this system, and decolonization and the rights of indigenous people to lead in the recreation of society with a different set of values and a different relationship between humans and nature and humans and other humans is the what we call that is less important to me.
We have 5 hands up. Can we get on with hearing from some folks? I think Anthony was next.
Yeah, first I'd like to thank Bonnie for her theological reflection. I totally agree that Jesus was a radical revolutionary and who preached that you can't serve God and money, and that you have to forgive debts. And if you follow those principles, then you can't be a capitalist. Capitalism is based on the commodification of everything. And that's why it's, I think, antithetical to real Christianity and authentic religion. One of the 2 things I think we haven't explored in my mind yet enough is the impact of capitalism on the environment and the corruption of democracy by capitalism, turning it into a plutocracy or actually kleptocracy. And they are related. So you want to say a little bit about capitalism and really the future of human life on the planet and how that will be affected by capitalism?
I posted a comment in the chat. I would really like to hear from everyone with their hands up, and then we come back and respond to some of these things.
Okay. In order, I think Donna was next, but I see she may have disappeared off the screen.
I'm here.
Donna's-
I'm here. I'm on the screen. I don't know whose screen I'm not on, but I'm on my screen. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we hear and see you.
All right. I was raised a technocrat. It was a utopian idea of the monad, the yin yang symbol was a symbol. It was a idea of a society where there'd be a sorry, that's my cat. Perfect balance between production and distribution, and that it would have to be brought into play when the price system collapsed, when the money system collapsed. And the way that the distribution would be is that you would measure the amount of ergs that it took to produce everything. And everyone on the continent, it was a continental idea, would have a budget of ergs to spend however they wanted. So I don't know, I don't understand why it wouldn't work, except that how do we get there from here? But I just like to say that I was raised with this idea. Everyone would have education, everyone would have an equal budget to spend, and it's a different kind of utopian technocracy. Started in the 30s, I believe. Now it's become a pejorative, and they're calling it a cult, but it wasn't.
I think, Ruby, did you wish to say something?
Yes, the questions that I had, I was like Steve, trying to write and everything. Some have been answered. Bonnie, I want to thank you again appearing. I remember you when you were here, Michael, what is the name of the book that you were reading to Sweden? And thank you for bringing up the environment, Anthony, and about the people, Michael, the imperial. We need to know the difference basically between capitalism, imperialism, what's happening, with the indigenous people. This really needs, this is what we're about, I feel. And this is what needs to be brought to the board. So I just want to thank you, Carolfrances and Michael, for your hard work on this work today.
Okay, Clay, you had some comments or questions? Clay, you're muted. Okay.
He unmuted. Go ahead, Clay.
His mic's been off the whole time.
Okay. Well, I think Richard's next then.
Okay. Just quickly, I'd like to strongly encourage everyone to read the 1916 Project. I was a history major, and I'm embarrassed by how little I learned about the realities of or exploitive history and and racist expropriating history. And I just the degree to which it has impacted and warped our socioeconomic political systems is beyond measure, right up to this very day. So I think we can talk all the more intelligently on these themes after having read that. And secondly, to recognize the urgency of finding alternatives to capitalism. I've not always talked this way. Those of you who know me know that. And just quickly, I think in the search for alternatives, we need to look seriously at the Mondragon worker-owned cooperative of Spain. We have some experimental stuff going on in Pomona along this line, and it's been said that we will never have a democratic politics until we have a democratic economy. And so take a look at that and some experiments going on around the country and worker-owned cooperatives, because short of a complete revolution, these can be steps. This can be a step in I think, a very constructive direction.
Hello, can you hear me now? I think I
Yes.
had some problems with my sound.
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, I want. This is my first time coming this. I find it very interesting. I worked for 5 years at a job where I started at noon and worked to 11, 10-hour days, 4 days a week. So getting up early is not kind of my preview. Anyway, just to speak to what Ruby said very briefly, imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism. And there's a lot of background on that, but that's essentially what it is capitalism developed to the point where it tries to conquer the world, and imperial powers try to conquer the third world, the global south. And that's where we are now. But I want to address the question that Bonnie raised about how communism will work. And I've had the same question. I've considered myself a Marxist-Leninist for about half a century now. But one part of what Marx talked about in terms of communism, the part that he didn't even try to answer really was, how would an advanced industrial technological society work without a state to organize its affairs? Because from my prior experience, I thought that would be, well, frankly, kind of inconceivable. But I've also been involved in IT for half a century, started about the same time in my college years. And prior to about 1969 and the emergence of open source software, and particularly Linux, I also assumed that a modern computer operating system, which could never be written by one person, but had to be written by teams, which would involve millions of lines of code that all had to work together succinctly, or it would be buggy and problems like Windows often has, would have to be put together by an authoritarian organization like a corporation or a state that could assign roles and, you know, set standards and all of this stuff. But then I started getting involved with Linux about 96 and was confronted with an operating system that was complete, relatively bug-free, and not owned by anybody. If people aren't familiar with Linux, I'm going to post a link to the general public license that Linux is written under. We call it copy left. It assures that anybody can make copies of the software, anybody can contribute to the software. The source code, which is really the key to understanding the software or improving it or debugging it or modifying it, has to be made available. And Linux was put together by a worldwide group of programmers from India, Mexico, America. Linus himself was originally from Finland. He moved to the United States. And if people aren't familiar with Linux, well, you're using it now, because Zoom runs on Linux. Gmail runs on Linux. Google runs on Linux. In fact, most of the internet runs on Linux. The cloud is based on Linux. And Linux is free. And Linux works better than any operating system that capitalism has produced. I call it communist software because it really does apply the principle of from each according to its abilities to each according to its needs. It can do that because it is software. And so if I write a program and I want to give you a copy of it, it'll cost me essentially nothing to make a copy, as opposed to a chair or a table or a house where obviously you'd have to get the materials, they cost something, et cetera, et cetera. If you want a copy of software, before maybe I could put it on a floppy disk or CD-ROM, now I could just email it to you. So there's really no cost involved. That has also made it the perfect capitalist product, because something once you produce it, no matter how much labor is involved in the production of it, if the cost of reproducing it is near zero, and you can establish a monopoly and a need for software like Microsoft has done, then basically you can set your own price and be a tax on the whole of society, including other capitalist enterprises. So I would just recommend people kind of look at Linux as a window in terms of how this would work. Because you see there's no hierarchy in Linux. Programmers work together on I say voluntary basis. You know, Linus Torvalds has long provided like leadership, but he has no authoritarian powers in terms of how the software develops. In fact, it's so far beyond him. 10 years ago, he was saying he contributed less than 2% of the code. Now I know it's much less than that. So that's just one thing I want to bring up. People probably weren't aware of. That system, Linux, the Linux system and open source system, I think not only provides us with the best technology we have today in the world, but also gives us a window to how society can work free of an authoritarian state, free of the kind of hierarchy we're used to organizing big projects. So anyway, thank you for having me.
We need to move toward closure. And I want to give fair warning. I need to absent myself at precisely 9:30. Vic, could you do our closing comments? when we are ready to do so. I'm not hearing you, but yes, okay. Anyway,
Yeah, sorry, I was muted. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
Point of order. Carolfrances, are you meeting after this session?
I think that was a no. I just want to say something quickly in response to Clay, because I think it's important to recognize that software exists on hardware, and hardware exists on profligate use of energy. And so a lot of things like the cloud and like Bitcoin are enormously destructive of the environment. So although I agree with what he said about Linux and the general collaborative aspects of open source and things like Reddit and but they're all privatized at the top somewhere. So Google obviously sells your information, even if it's based on something that's free and open source. And Google uses giant server farms, and those are all material realities that are exploited and expropriated. Anyway, we should probably try to wrap it up.
Okay. Well, could we move into announcements before we close?
Can I say something very briefly? The history of the Socialist Party of America and the Communist Party is that traditionally what happened, historically what happened is the Socialist Party said everybody will rise when we have socialism, so we don't have to deal with racism. Not that they didn't, but it wasn't a point of order, whereas the Communist Party made it their as very basic part of what their work was to unite different ethnicities. And the other thing is there are so many other isms that are alternatives to capitalism, anarchy, and just everything. And I think that we should, at least acknowledge that, if not in some later date, actually go into them. Syndicalism.
Ecofeminism.
Yeah, right.
Okay, do we have an announcement?
I had an announcement. Can I do my announcement? Yeah.
Was that you, Bonnie?
Yeah. So Neighborhood Unitarian Universalist Church of Pasadena and the San Gabriel Mosque are resuming our series of annual interfaith dinners and conversations after having missed last year. And it's going to be summer instead of February. So it's going to be Sunday, July 17th at Neighborhood Church at 5 p.m. And I'm going to put that in the chat with the address to RSVP, or you could just email me.
Thank you. Any other announcement?
Yeah, Michael, with a quick one. I think the KPFK has wrapped up its summer fund drive there were 2 days of raising funds for the Pacifica Radio Archives, but essentially the station is in the hole and the foundation is in the hole. So I do want to appeal to people, if they can, to become sustaining members of KPFK. And if you can reach out to the organizations that you're in at the base in terms of different, progressive-minded religious institutions. Historically, the UUs were one of the main sources of forming Pacifica as a pro-peace radio network and listener-sponsored and a non-commodity in that sense. It's based on free will donation, and it's failing for various reasons. I think at a disconnection with communities that are in struggle right now. But to the extent that we can get people to become basic members at $25, if tens of thousands of people did that, and there are tens of thousands of people in some of the organizations we're connected with, that would stabilize things financially and allow the station locally and the network nationally to reconnect with the mass movements that are out there today by giving them voice. So thank you.
ICUJP has become a monthly sponsor of KPFK, and I support Michael's call for that.
Could we go into our closing circle now and share what's in our minds and hearts for a moment, and then go to Dick for closing comments?
Go ahead,
I
Stephen.
just want to say one other thing. I think we tapped a little nerve here because I think this is the biggest turnout we've had in some time on these. I think there's a lot of interest in this, and we should definitely pursue it further. We had actually 2 screens full of participants at one point, which is the first time in a long time that we got over 24 or 25. So I think this is something that ICUJP wants to continue to look at. And thank everybody who came in for the first time today.
I just want to ask everyone to pray for Melissa Rubin.
Oh.
Jerry Rubin's, Jerry Westside Peacemaker Rubin's wife, who is a wonderful, loving, sweet, and totally supportive woman, loyal to Jerry Rubin and all his activism, completely supportive. She is in the hospital in hospice with pancreatic cancer. And I spoke with Jerry yesterday, who's a dear friend, and he is bereft with bereavement. And so please lend your prayer and support to Marissa Rubin.
I want to again lift up Maggie Hutchison, learning that she is suffering from COVID. She texted me that she got bounced off but couldn't rejoin today. I do want to name the 7 victims in Highland Park: Catherine Goldstein, Irina McCarthy, Kevin McCarthy, Stephen Strauss, Jacqueline Sundheim, Nicholas Toledo Zaragoza, and Eduardo Viuldo. I have a special connection because my wife Wendy is from Highland Park and knew people who knew people at the parade. It's just another devastating example of these mass shootings, over 300 this year, and the insufficiency of our ability to ban assault weapons and control guns in this society.
If I could add that for a minute, because people have talked about, well, you don't know why he did it. He wasn't racially or religiously motivated, but actually he was spotted casing one of the synagogues in that town a couple of weeks before, and they were suspicious of him, that they surreptitiously checked his backpack to make sure he wasn't carrying weapons. So I think that we need to be alert to that reality, that it's not disconnected from the kind of bigotry and white supremacy and anti-Semitism we've been talking about.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, I wanted to lift up, the people here in Los Angeles. The condition is ripe, toward the socialism or communism, and so the Christian must create a real Christian, because things are being represented in a different way at this point, and so capitalism is in crisis as well, and so hopefully the people here in United States can really be empowered and so forth, and so I thank you.
Phil, I'll take over if you need to leave.
Yeah, I need to go. Dick, you can
Yes,
do your
we'll do that.
closeout. Thank you. Steve.
Thank you for facilitating, Phil. I see Vita's hand. You're on mute, Vita. You're on mute.
Unmute Vita.
I want to hold up Rick Manalis as he cares for his father who is ill.
Yes. Anyone else to bring into this space? Thank you. We've asked Dick to send us off for the week ahead.
Okay. Well, excuse me, let us turn to the God of many names as we remember, reflect upon, pray for these who have been named, these precious men, women, young people, children. Let us be grateful for the Moses who stood up to Pharaoh in the cause of liberation, and grateful for the Jesus who said we cannot serve God and mammon, meaning money, and who said that if you have two coats and there's a person who has none, hand that person one coat. May we be thankful for such leadership across all the faith traditions, and for the leadership we have had up to the present time and at this gathering this morning, for your real grappling with tough issues, trying so hard to get past the propaganda and a culture of acquisition. And may we turn to our God of many names for help that we may embody such vision and hard work in the direction of love and of justice. And may we make love and justice at this time our absolute first priorities in all that we do. I wish we were present around the circle so we could be holding hands. So let's hold hands across this time and this space, and know that there's a deep love that holds us together, and that no amount of lying and deception can pull us apart. We are together, we are family, and we will be on the move, and we will stay on the move. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Dick. Thank you, everybody. A lot of newcomers. You are card-carrying members if you're still here. Please join us next Friday and each Friday for these important meetings. This was a meaningful program, and it was the best of ICUJP today. Thanks, everybody. Stay safe and be well.